The first time Emma Fitzgerald heard the voice, she thought it was only the wind slipping through the pines, thin, wavering, almost human. The woods behind her grandmother's house had always been dense, older than the town itself, tangled with roots that writhed like frozen serpents beneath the soil. But that evening, as the sun sank behind the tree line and shadows bled into the ground, the whisper rose again, clear enough to make her spine stiffen. Emma. Just her name, nothing more, spoken with the brittle softness of someone who had not used a voice in a very, very long time. Emma froze, her breath misting in the cold air. No one knew she came here. No one followed her. And certainly no one should have known her name. The path beneath her feet felt suddenly unsteady, as though the forest itself had shifted its weight, leaning closer, listening with her. She moved toward the sound, her heartbeat thudding in her ears, until she reached the forgotten patch of earth she had stumbled upon weeks earlier, a lonely dip in the ground marked only by a crooked stone draped in moss. No date, no name, no sign of who rested below. But tonight, something waited there. The air grew colder, wrapping around her wrist like a desperate hand. Emma's breath stilled. A soft glow shimmered above the stone, flickering like a candle guttering in a breeze. Slowly, it shaped itself, long strands of dripping hair, a small trembling frame, the faint outline of a girl not much younger than Emma herself. The figure lifted her face, and Emma's stomach twisted. The eyes staring back were wide, pleading, and glimmering with the dampness of a life cut short. Emma could not look away. When the girl finally spoke, her voice sounded like leaves crushed underfoot, fragile and half forgotten. "They buried me here," she whispered. But they were not supposed to. A cold wave swept through the clearing, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of old earth and something darker, something hidden for over a century. And as the fading light of dusk swallowed the last colors of the world, Emma realized the truth with a terror she could not name. Emma Fitzgerald had always felt a strange pull toward the woods behind her grandmother's property, an instinctive curiosity that seemed to thrum beneath her skin every time she stepped into the quiet, moss-covered clearing. She could never explain why she preferred this place over the noise of town, why the towering pines and twisted roots felt more familiar than the people she saw every day, but she returned again and again, as if something in the earth called her name long before she ever heard it spoken aloud. One chilly afternoon, as the winter sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, Emma paused near a dip in the forest floor, an area she had walked past without noticing dozens of times before. The ground there seemed slightly lopsided, a subtle indentation as though the earth had sighed inward. She crouched down out of instinct, brushing away a layer of leaves and brittle pine needles until a patch of old, weathered stone emerged beneath her fingertips. It wasn't carved or polished, just a rough, crooked slab half swallowed by the soil, but the moment she touched it, a prickling sensation crawled up her arm as if she had placed her hand on something alive. She jerked back, startled, but curiosity tugged her forward again. The wind had died completely, leaving the woods eerily silent except for the faint rustle of Emma's coat sleeve. She leaned closer, trying to determine whether she had found some forgotten landmark or a simple natural formation, when a sound rose so softly she wasn't sure it had happened at all. It was a whisper, delicate and thin, slipping between the trees like a breath of cold air. Emma blinked, listening hard, her pulse quickening. The whisper came again, just a faint murmur, but enough to make her skin tighten. She glanced around, expecting to see someone approaching on the trail, but the forest was completely still. Another whisper followed, so close this time it brushed her ear, and Emma's breath caught in her throat when she realized the sound wasn't coming from above or around her. It was coming from the ground beneath her feet. A soft, trembling voice seemed to rise from within the soil itself, its tone fragile and impossibly distant, like someone calling out from behind a wall of earth. Emma staggered backward, heart hammering, unsure if she had imagined the whole thing or if her mind was playing tricks on her, but the whisper persisted, a faint plea that seeped into the cold air around her. She strained to understand it, convinced she must be mishearing the wind, yet the voice grew clearer, forming words she could almost grasp. In that moment she knew without understanding how that she was hearing something no living person should have been able to hear, and the realization anchored her to the spot as the world around her seemed to hold its breath. Emma stood completely still, the cold air pressing against her skin as she tried to steady her racing breath. The whisper had already rattled her, already pushed her senses to the edge, But the moment that truly fractured her understanding of reality came without warning. She had been staring at the crooked stone, trying to convince herself the sound was merely an echo or some trick of the wind, when the voice rose again, clearer, sharper, and unmistakably direct. This time it wasn't a vague murmur or a distant sigh. It was her name. Spoken with a trembling certainty that reached her like a hand gripping her shoulder from behind. The way it wrapped around the syllables felt intimate and deliberate, as if the speaker knew her deeply, as if they had waited for her. Emma. Her knees weakened beneath her as the sound echoed through her mind. She had never told anyone about her visits to this part of the woods. Not her grandmother. Not her friends. Not a single person in town even knew she slipped away to this forgotten clearing. It was her secret escape, a place she wandered to when she needed silence or answers she didn't know how to phrase. The idea that someone or something had been watching her long enough to learn her name chilled her more than the winter air ever could. She turned slowly, scanning the forest in every direction, her eyes darting toward every shifting shadow and dark patch between the trees. No footsteps. No movement. No breathing. Only the heavy, unnatural stillness that seemed to coil tighter around her the longer she listened. Emma called out, her voice unsteady, asking who was there, but her words dissolved into the quiet like they were swallowed whole. The forest didn't return a single sound. Even the birds had fallen silent. The whisper of her name floated through the clearing again, softer this time, almost coaxing, almost pleading, as though whoever spoke it was trying to draw her closer. Emma's heart pounded painfully against her ribs, torn between the instinct to run and the pull of a curiosity she couldn't shake. The voice didn't sound malicious, it sounded exhausted, like someone who had been waiting far too long. That frightened her most of all, because nothing alive could have followed her here in such utter silence, and nothing human would know how to hide so completely yet speak so clearly. Emma felt the weight of the woods tighten around her, the air pressing in, as if the forest itself had turned its gaze toward her, listening to her reaction, waiting to see whether she would answer the dead calling her name. Emma returned to the clearing the next afternoon, though every instinct told her to stay away. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the whisper of her name again and again until she could no longer tell whether she had imagined it or whether something buried beneath the cold earth had truly spoken to her. Yet despite the dread that coiled in her stomach, something stronger pulled her back, a need to understand, a quiet desperation to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her grip on reality. As she stepped through the trees, the clearing felt different this time, heavier somehow, as if the ground remembered her footsteps. She knelt beside the crooked stone again, brushing away the damp leaves and soil, studying every inch of it in the pale daylight. With the sun slicing through the branches, she saw more clearly than before how out of place the stone truly was. It had no markings at all. No chiseled lines, no date, no name, not even the faintest sign of erosion consistent with a proper grave marker. It looked less like a memorial and more like a stone someone had placed there in a hurry, as if trying to cover something rather than honor it. Emma ran her fingers along the rough edges, feeling the uneven grooves as if they held a secret. She had explored the woods countless times throughout her childhood, stumbling upon old family plots and forgotten markers from the 1800s, all carved with care and pride even if the years had worn them down. But this stone was wrong. It didn't belong to any family cemetery, didn't fit the style of any grave she had ever seen. It was deliberately plain, intentionally unremarkable. Someone had wanted the person buried here to be forgotten. That realization settled over her slowly, like frost forming on a windowpane. The ground around it, too, seemed disturbed in a way she hadn't noticed before, with the soil looser than it should have been after so many years. She wondered if animals had dug at it or if the earth itself had shifted, but something about the indentation felt purposeful rather than natural. Emma couldn't shake the sense that this place had been hidden on purpose, not out of respect, but out of fear or shame. The thought sent a chill crawling up her spine. Why bury someone in the middle of the woods, alone and unmarked? Why attempt to erase their existence entirely? She leaned closer, her breath trembling as she studied the stone's surface again, feeling that same prickling sensation she experienced the day before. It was as though the ground held a memory, something trapped beneath it that resisted being forgotten, something that had begun to stir the moment she uncovered the stone. Emma realized that if the whispers she heard were real, Then the silence around this grave had been broken for the first time since 1849, and whatever had been hidden here was no longer willing to remain silent. Emma didn't return to the woods for several days after discovering the unmarked grave. The whispers lingered in her mind, curling into her thoughts no matter how hard she tried to bury them. Every night she lay awake listening to the wind scrape across the window, wondering if it was trying to form her name again. Eventually, a restless unease pushed her back into the forest, drawn by the same inexplicable force that had pulled her since the beginning. The air felt colder than it should have been for late autumn, and the sky hung low and swollen with dark clouds that threatened to burst at any moment. As she approached the clearing, she noticed how the trees seemed to huddle together, their branches creaking like old bones preparing for a storm. She hesitated, but a sudden gust of wind flung dead leaves across her path as if urging her forward. Not long after she reached the grave, the first rumble of thunder rolled through the sky, deep and uneasy. Emma felt the atmosphere shift, tightening like a held breath. The air grew heavier, the pressure prickling against her skin, and clouds swirled in unnatural patterns overhead. Rain began as a soft drizzle before turning into a fierce downpour, soaking her hair and clothes within seconds. She shielded her eyes, trying to make out the grave marker through the blur of water, when a strange shimmer caught her attention. At first she thought it was lightning reflecting off the stone, but the shape was wrong, too steady, too deliberate. The shimmering brightened, gathering into a faint outline suspended above the earth. Emma stumbled back, her boots slipping against the slick ground as she blinked desperately against the rain. The outline sharpened. Long strands of hair clung to a small, hunched form. Water streamed through empty spaces where flesh should have been, dripping from a bowed head. Slowly, the figure lifted her face. Emma's breath hitched painfully in her throat at the sight of hollow, darkened eyes staring back at her, eyes filled with something between sorrow and accusation. The apparition flickered with every bolt of lightning, as though the storm itself was tearing her between this world and whatever lay beyond. The soaked, trembling figure seemed impossibly fragile, yet her presence pressed against Emma with chilling clarity, as if demanding to be seen. Emma couldn't move, rooted in place by fear and fascination. The rain hammered around them, drowning out the forest's usual sounds, leaving only the storm and the soft, quivering outline of the girl. The apparition's lips parted slightly, trembling as if trying to form words, but no sound emerged. Still, Emma felt the weight of the girl's stare, a silent plea layered with desperation. In that moment Emma realized the storm had not summoned the spirit had summoned the storm, using the chaos of the weather to break through whatever barrier had kept her hidden. Emma stood frozen as the apparition wavered before her, a fragile shape carved out of cold light and rain. The storm crashed through the trees with a violence that felt strangely deliberate, as if nature itself had been pulled into the moment. Emma's instincts screamed for her to run, but something deeper held her in place, a quiet understanding that the spirit wasn't there to harm her but to be heard. The girl's lips parted again, and this time, a faint sound broke through the thunder. It was barely more than a breath at first, a trembling exhale that carried an ache older than the storm itself. Emma leaned forward, straining to catch the words as the figure's voice emerged in thin, cracking fragments. The spirit spoke her first full sentence with effort, as though every word had to claw its way through the veil that kept the dead silent. "I didn't die the way they said." The confession hung in the air with a weight that pushed against Emma's chest. She swallowed hard, barely able to process the meaning behind the words. The town's history books were filled with vague tragedies from the 1840s, fires, illnesses, accidents, but none of them had ever mentioned a girl buried in the woods without a name, without a marker, without a story. The apparition trembled, her form flickering as lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating her hollow eyes. More words followed, straining against the storm as if the truth itself resisted being spoken. "They silenced me." The girl's voice wavered, rising in a painful whisper. "They didn't want anyone to know." Emma felt her heartbeat stutter. The sharpness of those words struck her with a force that cut through the wind and rain. This wasn't a ghost trapped by unfinished business or lingering grief. This was a child who had been wronged, erased, and left beneath the earth without justice. Emma sensed the depth of the girl's fear and remembered the unmarked stone, the careless grave, the feeling that someone had tried desperately to hide this place from the world. Now the spirit's presence made that truth undeniable. As the girl continued to speak, her voice broke in and out with the storm, but the pieces she managed to push through painted a picture more horrifying than Emma could have imagined. She hadn't died of sickness. She hadn't wandered into the woods by accident. Someone had taken her life deliberately, sealing the truth in soil and shadows. The realization settled inside Emma like ice, chilling her from the spine outward. This was no simple haunting. This was a plea for justice, one that had waited more than a century for someone who could finally hear it. The spirit's flickering form dimmed slightly, her eyes fixed on Emma with a raw desperation that made her chest tighten, as if the dead girl believed Emma was her last chance to reveal what had truly happened beneath those silent trees. Emma returned to the clearing with a mixture of dread and determination, her mind still echoing with the chilling confession she had heard from the spirit. The forest was quieter than usual, the storm long gone but leaving behind a wet, oppressive stillness that clung to the trunks of the trees and the mossy ground. She knelt once more beside the crooked stone, brushing away fallen leaves and mud with trembling fingers, and that familiar prickling sensation rose again along her arms. Something beneath the earth seemed to pulse, as if impatient for her return. She began to probe the ground carefully with a small stick she had brought, moving aside loose soil with increasing precision, until her fingers hit something unexpected, something hollow, smooth, and clearly man-made. Her heart beat faster, a mix of fear and anticipation tightening in her chest, as she dug gently around it. Finally, she unearthed a small, weathered box, almost perfectly preserved despite the decades of exposure to moisture and decay. It was made of a dark wood, its surface roughened and cracked by time, with a simple iron clasp rusted shut. Her breath caught as she pried it open, revealing its contents: a diary, its leather cover worn and delicate, the pages inside yellowed and brittle but still legible. Emma lifted the diary carefully, cradling it as though it were alive. The handwriting inside was small and precise, a careful script that had faded with age but still bore the imprint of its creator's hand. She flipped the pages with reverence and fear, reading the entries one by one. The first few were mundane, chronicling daily routines, the rhythms of life in 1849, small joys and quiet sorrows. But as she continued, a darker pattern emerged. The entries became frantic, almost fearful, hinting at events that were never meant to be shared, at secrets hidden behind closed doors. Names were omitted, places vaguely referenced, but the fear and urgency behind the words were unmistakable. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized she was holding a direct connection to the girl whose whispers had drawn her here, a tangible thread to a life that had been deliberately erased. Every word seemed to resonate with the emotions she had sensed from the apparition, each sentence a cry that had been trapped for more than a century. Certain passages sent shivers down her spine, describing encounters with people who were kind in appearance but cruel in deed, moments when the writer had sensed danger closing in, and hints that she was being watched, manipulated, and ultimately silenced. Symbols appeared in the margins, cryptic marks that Emma did not yet understand but felt instinctively were important. The diary did not merely confirm the spirit's presence, it illuminated the world in which she had lived and died, the networks of fear and secrecy that had kept her buried, and the injustices that had been carefully hidden. Emma realized that this small box, this fragile diary, was more than a relic. It was a key to uncovering the truth, a bridge between the living and the dead, and the first undeniable proof that the girl had existed, had suffered, and had a story that demanded to be heard. After discovering the diary, Emma felt a strange combination of exhilaration and unease, as though she had finally glimpsed the threads of a story that had been deliberately severed over a century ago. She carried the fragile book back to her room, keeping it wrapped in a scarf to protect it from the damp chill, but she could not escape the feeling that her connection to the past was intensifying in ways she did not fully understand. That night, long after the house had fallen silent, she noticed something odd as she glanced out her window toward the garden. The ground, slick from the recent rain, bore faint scratches and smudges that seemed deliberate rather than natural. At first, she assumed it was the wind or a passing animal, but then she noticed the shapes were not random. They resembled the strange symbols she had seen in the margins of the diary. Her pulse quickened. She rushed outside, boots squelching in the mud, trying to trace the marks, only to find that they formed no complete pattern, as if someone or something was testing her, leaving fragments of a message she had not yet learned to read. Over the following days, the symbols began appearing more frequently, in places that made no sense. They were drawn into the condensation on her window, scrawled faintly into the dust on her furniture, and even etched into the soil along the narrow path that led from her house to the woods. Emma felt a rising sense of intrusion, as if an unseen presence had entered her life and was deliberately reaching out, guiding her attention to hidden details she might have otherwise missed. Each new symbol felt like a breadcrumb, a fragment of a larger puzzle, yet the deliberate nature of their placement made it impossible to dismiss them as coincidence. She began keeping a notebook, recording the shapes and comparing them to the markings in the diary, hoping to uncover a pattern, but every attempt only deepened the sense of mystery, and a quiet fear began to creep in. Someone or something was watching her, and the boundary between past and present, living and dead, was blurring in ways she could not fully comprehend. The symbols carried an energy that made her skin prickle, as if they were alive, imbued with the desperate intention of their original author. It became increasingly clear that the diary was not merely a historical artifact but a conduit, a vessel that had allowed the girl's memory and unfinished story to bleed into Emma's world. The more Emma observed the symbols, the more she realized that they were attempting to communicate something urgent, a message meant only for her. Each mark seemed to echo the voice she had heard in the woods, fragile and pleading, yet filled with authority. The presence behind them was persistent, intelligent, and unyielding, insisting that she pay attention, that she understand, and that she act upon the truth that had been buried for decades. The signs were no longer subtle. They had become a haunting insistence, a tangible proof that the dead were reaching beyond their graves, and that Emma's life was now entangled with secrets that had been carefully hidden and fiercely protected since 1849. Emma had begun to feel the walls of her world tighten around her, the once comforting familiarity of her home now seeming charged with a tension she could not explain. The symbols in her room had multiplied overnight, appearing in corners she had checked just hours before, as though an invisible hand had scrawled them while she slept. The diary rested open on her desk, the pages fluttering faintly in a draft that had no source, and every time she touched it, the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. That evening, she decided to walk to the edge of town, hoping the crisp night air might clear her mind, though she felt a persistent unease tugging at her. As she passed the last few houses before the old forest began, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. An old woman, hunched and draped in layers of faded fabric, emerged from behind a tree with a slow, deliberate shuffle. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, fixed on Emma with a depth of recognition that startled her. The woman's mouth moved before Emma could speak, her voice hoarse but insistent. "You must stop," she said. "Stop listening to the dead. Some truths are not meant for the living." Emma's brow furrowed, half in confusion, half in defiance. She had thought herself alone in this ordeal, but here was someone who seemed to understand the forces she had barely begun to perceive. I don't understand," she stammered. "They need me to listen. I have to." The woman cut her off sharply, leaning closer despite her frailty. Her eyes glimmered with an intensity that pierced the cold night air. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The dead are patient, but not merciful. Some things are buried for a reason. Leave it alone, child, or it will consume more than your curiosity." Emma felt a shiver race down her spine, and yet her resolve did not falter. Her mind replayed the whispers in the forest, the hollow eyes of the apparition, the desperate pleas in the diary, and she could not reconcile turning away. The woman seemed to sense her inner struggle, her expression softening, but a warning lingered in her voice. "You are entangled now. There is no simple return to ignorance. What you see, what you hear, will follow you. Stop before it's too late." Before Emma could respond, the woman retreated into the darkness, blending seamlessly with the night. Emma stood frozen, the damp air pressing against her face, the echo of the warning ringing in her ears. The forest behind the edge of town seemed unnaturally silent, almost expectant, as though it had witnessed the exchange and acknowledged the old woman's words. Emma's curiosity and fear collided in a whirlwind inside her chest. The warning had been clear, the presence of the past pressing insistently against her life, but the pull to uncover the truth was stronger than any sense of safety. She realized then that she was not merely exploring history or a lingering ghost story. She had stepped into something far more dangerous, a living web of secrets that had waited for someone willing enough and perhaps reckless enough to listen. The next days brought an unsettling clarity that Emma had not anticipated. She had begun piecing together fragments from the diary and the symbols that appeared in her room, trying to make sense of the cryptic messages left by the girl who had called to her from beneath the soil. But the more she dug into the history, the more the edges of the story began to point toward her own family, revealing connections she was unprepared to confront. Late one night, after tracing the symbols in her notebook against the diary's entries, she discovered recurring names and locations that seemed vaguely familiar, subtle hints that someone in the girl's life had moved in proximity to the Fitzgerald family. Her pulse quickened as she realized that some of the entries mentioned events and people whose descendants still lived in the town, descendants who were now part of her family. The thought tightened her chest, a cold hand that refused to let go, as she imagined the possibility that her own lineage might be intertwined with the tragedy she had uncovered. Emma returned to the forest with the diary in her coat, feeling as if the trees themselves leaned closer, listening to her thoughts. She retraced the steps of the girl's last known movements, following the faint indications of long-forgotten paths that were barely more than depressions in the soil, and she noticed how the landscape seemed to echo what she had read. Locations described in vague, fearful terms corresponded uncannily with properties and homesteads her own family had occupied for generations. Every turn in the undergrowth and every hollow tree seemed to whisper a name she recognized, a familial connection that made her heart pound in disbelief. She realized that the stories had been passed down quietly, unspoken secrets that her parents and grandparents had carried without ever acknowledging them. Each new clue was more than just a historical footnote, it was proof that the girl's life and death had been touched by those she now counted among her ancestors. The more Emma uncovered, the heavier the weight of revelation became. Diaries of distant relatives, faded letters tucked into boxes in her attic, and even old photographs that had always seemed innocuous now revealed subtle hints, glances, gestures, and presences in the background that aligned with the diary's warnings and the girl's fearful entries. She understood that uncovering the truth was not merely an academic exercise, it was a confrontation with the past that her family had tried to bury, with acts and omissions that had been carefully hidden. The forest seemed to pulse with urgency as if it had been waiting for her to connect the dots, and Emma realized that the spirit's plea was not just for remembrance but for accountability. Every discovery tied her closer to the unresolved trauma, and the realization that the people who had silenced the girl might have been the same blood that flowed through her veins filled her with a mixture of horror and responsibility. She now understood that the mystery she had followed into the woods was no longer just the story of a forgotten girl, it was a reflection of her own family's shadowed history, a secret that had been preserved in silence, and one that could no longer remain hidden without dire consequences. Emma's nights became restless, haunted by the girl's voice, the symbols, and the diary's fragile pages. Each discovery had pulled her deeper into a web of secrets that stretched back more than a century, and now she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her with an intensity she had never experienced before. The whispers no longer came only in the forest, they followed her into her home, curling through the hallways and flickering at the edge of her vision. The girl's pleas were clear, she wanted justice. But Emma knew that delivering it would mean exposing truths that had been deliberately buried, truths that implicated people still living, and some of them bound to her own family. The thought of revealing such secrets made her stomach churn, and yet she understood that silence would be a betrayal far greater than any fear she felt. She returned to the clearing with the diary in hand, rain-slicked leaves sticking to her boots, and the hollow stone looming like a sentinel over the grave. Kneeling, she placed the book gently upon the earth and whispered to the spirit, asking how she could honor her request. The apparition shimmered, flickering between faint outlines and more tangible form, her eyes wide with an unspoken desperation. Emma realized that this was not simply about uncovering history, it was about confronting the long-standing acts of cruelty and suppression that had allowed an innocent life to be erased. The diary, the symbols, and the voice in the woods were all tools, guiding her to a reckoning that had been postponed for over a century. The more Emma understood, the more terrifying the task became. Exposing the truth would unearth connections that her family had buried in silence, alliances, and betrayals that could shatter reputations and rewrite the very foundation of what she had thought she knew about her lineage. Yet every instinct that urged her to turn away was countered by the persistence of the girl's presence, by the urgency in her voice and in the symbols that continued to appear at her window. The forest seemed alive with anticipation, almost impatient, as if it had waited all these years for someone willing to listen and act. Emma felt that if she faltered, the girl's story would die again, condemned to obscurity for another 100 years, and the injustice would remain unresolved. In the midst of the looming threat, Emma found herself facing a paradox. The more she uncovered, the closer she came to understanding the depth of betrayal and cruelty woven into the past, yet the closer she came, the greater the personal cost. Justice for the girl required courage and sacrifice, a willingness to challenge not only the town's historical silence but the complicity embedded within her own family. The spirit's gaze remained fixed on her, pleading silently, urging her forward, and Emma knew with absolute certainty that this was a choice she could not evade. The truth demanded exposure, and she had become its vessel, bound by the impossible task of delivering justice for a life that had been intentionally erased, a secret that had survived decades only to fall squarely into her hands.